I first wanted to start out by asking you if you were somewhat baffled by the title of this lecture, because we got lots of calls about what is this, the Caribbean Sea meeting the Indian Ocean. You were baffled. Thank you for admitting that. And I will first try by kind of explaining the metaphor I've chosen to use as a title for today's talk. And let me begin by telling you about the first time the Caribbean Sea met the Indian Ocean, at least in my life, symbolically. And this was in the mid-70s when I was living in Calcutta, which was our home at the time. And I used to read a newspaper, an English daily of the area called The Statesman, which is the main English daily of West Bengal. And I was reading about the test match that was going on at Eden Gardens at the time. And I remember asking my father why a person called Alvin Kalicharan was playing for the West Indian team. And now some of you who followed cricket in the 1970s must certainly remember Kalicharan. And Kalicharan seemed like such an Indian-sounding name to me, but here he was playing for the West Indies. And that's what had brought him to Eden Gardens. And that's when my father told me first about the South Asian diaspora, which spread all the way from, say, Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia to Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and even Trinidad and Guyana in South America. And I think that, for me, was the first metaphoric meeting of the Caribbean Sea with the Indian Ocean. Now, there's another reason I've picked this somewhat fluid marine title for this talk, and that's, in a way, a nod to some of the work that's being done by a few critics in English literature, coming out of, actually particularly coming out of Duke University in the US, but it's an international group of scholars, and it's a project called Oceans Connect. And this project is, in a way, a search for an alternative method of organizing nations and cultures and studying them, alternative to the current, landmass continental way of organization. So this searches, this sort of a marine point of view, allows scholars to study nations and populations along different axes. And it allows, for example, for a type of thinking which can look at something called the Atlantic culture, which would include much of Western Europe, North America, South America, the Caribbean, and even West Africa. Or even think about something called Mediterranean culture, which will allow us to look at both Southern Europe and Northern Africa as a place where a lot of interminglings happen and where identities are fluid and there are exchanges. This is another reason I decided to pick this. I decided to pick the marine theme when the Caribbean Sea meets the Indian Ocean. And I know Bunny was extremely worried that this might be taken to be a geography lecture and made me put the colon and add a little subtitle to it, So this was, so you wouldn't come here thinking this is going to be another geography lesson. But maybe it'll turn out to be a geography lesson of sorts for us anyway, a lesson in cultural geography. I want to go back to that incredible batsman from the West Indies, Alvin Kalicharan. We're next to a flying club, so this is going to happen. In the 1970s, whether he was at Lord's in London or in Eden Gardens in Calcutta, Alvin Kalicharan nudged the Caribbean Sea a bit closer to the Indian Ocean. Beginning with his debut test match in New Zealand in 1972, the Indo-Guyanese, and Alvin Kalicharan is Indo-Guyanese, batsman commanded the attention of cricket-mad South Asia and reminded an entire subcontinent of a nearly forgotten diasporic community across the Kalapani, or the Black Waters. And this remembrance was not one-sided. As the Marxist historian from the Caribbean, C.L.R. James, has famously noted in his book Beyond the Boundary, many cricket fans in the Caribbean also, at the same time, became aware of a shared global heritage of the so-called British Commonwealth by concentrating on a green cricket pitch overrun by men in white. The cricket pitch often becomes a place, for example, where the South African meets the West Indian and meets the Pakistani and the Australian. Now, when I was in Delhi for a couple of days before I came to Pakistan, and funnily enough, it was quite a moment of serendipity for me. I was reading the Hindustan Times on February 14, and the Sunday magazine section ran an article on identity. And there, again, pops up culture. And this was, I took this as a sign because I had already planned on this talk, and here I am sitting in Delhi, and I'm reading this article, and I'll read to you a little bit. I filched it from my uncle's newspaper and just brought it here. And this is a story about what happened to Kalichurn in 1975. It says, the West Indian cricketer Alvin Kalichurn was a tour of India in 1975. A wizened old man from Bihar came calling to Calcutta to say Kali was the son of his brother who had migrated to the other world, to the Caribbean. Kali, as he explained, looked just like his brother, but alas, it wasn't so. It did, however, set the stylish, left-handed batsman on his own odyssey. Turns out Kalichurn did, in the end, locate the original ancestral village from which his great-grandfathers had immigrated to the Caribbean. I will talk today about Indo-Caribbean literary movement, a movement which is gathering tremendous momentum both in the Caribbean and in Europe and North America. Migration, forced and voluntary, is of course an issue that is of acute importance to Pakistan. And part of what I want to do today is remind us of the long history of enforced migration, a history which stretches far beyond 1947. While exploring the context of 19th century Indian migrations to the Caribbean, the imagined recrossings of the Kalapani 150 years later, and the ensuing problematics of cultural, national, and racialized identities, I will focus on the writings of the British Guyanese writer David Dabadine. Dabadine took part in this imagined recrossing through the cricket pitch as well, as he followed the games of people like Rohan Kanhai, Alvin Kalichurn, Sunny Ramadan, as a young boy in Guyana. And he's written about it in an interview where he says this was the Indo-Guyanese's first introduction to India by following the matches of his own cricket team. But to fully appreciate the pleasures and the difficulties encountered by Dabadine and his contemporaries in recrossing those black waters, it is necessary to remember those original vessels, or to use the Indo-Caribbean poet Mahaday Dasa's words, those wooden missions of imperialist designs, those British ships, setting out from Hooghly Harbor near Calcutta, bound for Port of Spain in Trinidad or Georgetown in British Guyana. While some Indian indentured laborers were taken to islands such as Jamaica, Barbados, Martinique, and Cuba, the majority landed in Guyana and Trinidad. Of the 551,000 indentured laborers brought from India to the Caribbean, 238,900 arrived in British Guyana, what is now known as just Guyana, and 143,900 arrived in Trinidad. Between 1838 and 1917, indentured laborers from India crossed the dreaded Kalapani in thousands in order to compensate for the post-emancipation labor shortage in the British colonial sugar estates. It's crucial that 1838 is the date when the first indentured laborers, or the coolies, make the voyage, because a year earlier, in 1837, the slaves had finally been emancipated in the British colonies, and there was tremendous labor shortage in those sugar plantations, which was the site of production for cheap sugar for much of Europe and England. Now, East Indian laborers, and in the Caribbean, people of South Asian descent are called East Indians. East Indian laborers were transported often as punishment for such activities against the empire as taking part in the mutiny of 1857. And in the British Caribbean colonies, they form a large part of the South Asian diaspora. Importantly, many of the indentured laborers coming from India were women, often unmarried mothers and wives running away from abusive homes. In fact, V.S. Naipaul once declared in a conference at the University of West Indies
that his paternal great-grandmother was one of these unmarried women who made the dreaded journey across the seas with her small son, Naipaul's own grandfather. These coolies, and I again use the word coolies with a sense of irony because in the Caribbean, the coolie is also an incredibly loaded invective, a 150-year-old invective, but in recent times, the word has been reappropriated again by scholars with a sense of pride. So I use the word advisedly here. These coolies labored on the sugarcane fields to provide a sweetener for the tea produced by the peasants in Assam and Bengal. So you can imagine that sweet hot tea, the bread and the very sweet jam with lots of sugar in it, that meal of the working class British which replaced the hot supper in the 19th century as more and more women went to work in the factories, is a real meeting point of the South Asian peasant working in the tea gardens and the coolie sugarcane cutter in the Caribbean. While subcontinental culture has been part of Caribbean traditions since the arrival of the Indian indentured laborers in 1838, Indo-Caribbean writing has started to receive serious critical attention only within the last 2 decades. Even scholarly work in Caribbean history often turns a blind eye to the Indo-Caribbean history, rendering almost half the population of certain countries like Trinidad and Guyana almost invisible. In his authoritative work From Columbus to Castro, Eric Williams, who is one of the foremost historians of the Caribbean, devotes only 14 out of 515 pages to Indian indentured laborers. Now, given the fact that Williams's own island, Trinidad, boasts of an Indian population that's equal in number to the Afro-Caribbean one, this oversight is ironic indeed. And in fact, this oversight is quite representative of most of the histories of the Caribbean. Nonetheless, recently, major international conferences organized by different people such as Frank Birbal Singh in Toronto, David Dabadine and Brinsley Samaru in Warwick, England, and even the 3 history conferences organized by the University of West Indies, there has been a great rekindling in the critical interest in Indo-Caribbean literature and in the narratives of those jihadi bhais. Jihadi bhais was the word that the indentured laborers gave to their shipboard mates. And often the relationship that was formed between these indentured laborers on ships became to replace familial ties in a new land. And these narratives of the jihadi bhais are finally rekindling critical interest once again. However, with the notable exception of someone like Paul Thoreau's Sir Vidya or V.S. Naipaul, Indo-Caribbean authors are still relatively invisible to the global Anglophone readership. V.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas is undoubtedly one of the better-known Indo-Caribbean fictions. Often, when I talk about Indo-Caribbean fiction, that's the only one people can think of, or V.S. Naipaul is someone people can think of. But there are others, Sam Selvon's novels set in the Caribbean, such as Turnagain Tiger, and the writings of authors such as Ismath Khan, Harold Sunny Ladu, Sheikh Sadiq, Ruplal Monar, and Janice Scheinborn form a growing body of Indo-Caribbean fiction since the 1950s. There are certain characteristic settings explored by all these works. There is the sugar plantations, the East Indian villages of interior Guyana and Trinidad, the East Indian settlements in cities such as Port of Spain and Georgetown, and there are certain even stock pieces of the Indo-Caribbean work, the cane cutter story, the Indo-Caribbean pastoral of rural life, the escape from agriculture and arrival to the city. And the last one, the escape from agriculture, is a very important one because most people of South Asian descent living in the Caribbean are still rural people. And they're mostly agriculturists. And so this motif of leaving the interiors, the rural areas, and arriving in the urban centers is often an important one for the novel. And to this list, I would also add the migration sequence, usually to Europe or North America, of the second generation of Caribbean writers. This afternoon, I've chosen to focus on the British Guyanese author, David Dabadine, because his writings present all these set pieces of Indo-Caribbean literary culture. Starting with The Intended, David Dabadine's literary work has mapped the East Indian experience, albeit in reverse chronological order. Dabadeen began his novelistic career with a 1970s immigrant story and has progressively delved backwards into East Indian coolie history. His most recent work, The Counting House, has taken the author's work full circle and landed the reader in the early days of indenture. Going backwards, or attempting to recapture a lost moment, is no doubt one of Dabadeen's, and indeed much of the other Indo-Guyanese writers' preoccupations. All three of his novels end in some sort of disappearance, erasure, extinction, often physical, but always with larger conceptual implications. This talk then attempts to discover if the extinct and the erased can be resurrected, and moreover, if they can be neatly sorted out from the debris of a motley past. And because history, as many of us who visit Pakistan from across the Wagah border, is often stunningly irreversible, and it is often impossible to go back to what we have once left behind. Now I'll tell you a little bit more about Dabadeen. He's a novelist, a poet, an art historian, a literary scholar, and he's also the director of the Center for Caribbean Studies at the University of Warwick. He is self-consciously a part of a distinct literary movement which seeks to find a place for Indo-Caribbean writings both in the academy and in bookstores. Dabadeen's novels, The Intended, which was published in 1991, and The Counting House, which was published in 1996, and his collected poems in Coolie Song, 1994, reconstruct the history of Indians in Guyana from the early period of indentureship to 20th century migrations to Caribbean and European urban centers. The Intended, Dabadeen's first novel, is a novel about an artist's coming of age. Often the first novel is the novel about the artist's coming of age. Here he transfers Conrad's Belgian Congo from the heart of darkness upon the streets of 1970s London as he charts the histories of 4 Black and Asian teenagers struggling to survive in a racially polarized nation. The Counting House, which came out most recently, is his most recent novel, and it shifts the focus to the female experience in 19th century Guyana. This novel is pieced together from 7 artifacts that really were found in one of the old plantations in Guyana, and it creates 2 rival female narratives in a colonial sugar estate. There is the narrative of Rohini, who is the Indian woman who's a coolie who's come over from India, Rohini's Indian tale, and Miriam, who's the ex-slave. Her Afro-Caribbean tale are the 2 rival narratives. And The Counting House is also much more tenacious than his first novel in its desire to trace the development of an emerging Indo-Caribbean literary identity which seeks to distinguish itself from a more dominant Afro-Caribbean discourse. Now, before I go further, I'm going to add this, that such a distinction between the East Indian and the Afro-Caribbean, especially from the author's immigrant location in Britain, may be neither possible nor desirable. Fluid Caribbean identities resist easy binary distinctions of Indian or West Indian, Black or brown, and even Hindu or Muslim. And in fact, in the Caribbean, one of the most important festivals for the people of South Asian descent is a festival called Hosay, spelled H-O-S-A-Y in the Caribbean, and it is in fact Muharram. But Muharram in the Caribbean is actually something in which both Hindus and Muslims take part, and the Afro-Creoles see it as a very Indo-Caribbean event, not something that's particularly Muslim. Now let me begin with Dabadeen's most recent work. While many of the Indo-Caribbean authors actively seek to locate that which is Indian in the Caribbean, it is a mission that fails more often than not. Dabadeen's work is most successful, in fact, at the moment of its failure to construct a separate, discrete India in the Caribbean. In fact, The Counting House faces difficulty in constructing an India outside the Caribbean as well. The dialect used by Rohini and Vidya, the 2 characters, and the other Indian villagers in the first chapter, which is the only section in the novel set in Asia, sounds more West Indian than South Asian. As a result, we're treated to an Indian subcontinent replete with unexpected West Indian sounds and accents and spelling conventions. And oddly enough, the reader glimpses a veritable Caribbean in the India and not an India in the Caribbean at all. David Dabadeen's Counting House seems to be a rather clear response to the increasingly audible complaints heard in Indo-Caribbean academic circles for increased focus on East Indian women's experiences. The Counting House answers to exactly these frustrations voiced in conferences across Europe and North America. The novel charts the life of Rohini and Vidya, a young couple who flee mid-19th century rural India gripped with the violence of 1857, and they arrive as indentured laborers in a sugar estate in British Guyana. The estate, called Plantation Albion, which is a very loaded name, is the site of the coolies' encounter with the newly freed African slaves. While Rohini eventually strikes a friendship with an older black woman, Miriam, Vidya fails to find succor in the sugarcane fields and attempts to make the voyage home to India, only to drown. So the novelist quite conspicuously kills his male Indian protagonist, also conspicuously called Vidya, no doubt a reference to Mr. Vidyadhar Suraj Prasad himself, V.S. Naipaul, and makes room for a female voice in Guyana. However, the reader can never comfortably quell the suspicion that Rohini's female East Indian voice is perhaps too tragically locked in resistance to that of the male writers from the Caribbean. Rohini's chief rival, as well as her best friend, is an ex-slave woman. It is the friendship and the arguments between these two women which represents the dialogic relationship between African and South Asian populations in the New World. After Rohini becomes pregnant with the white plantation owner's child, Miriam says this to her, and this is now from the novel. Albion is we land, we man and we story, and I tell it how I want. I start the story and I kill it, so you, Rohini, hush and listen, for you is only a freshly come coolie. When I give you freedom to talk, then you talk. But when I wave my chisel any time and interrupt and take over the story and keep it or throw it away, what right have you to make story? What right have you to make baby for Gladstone? Albion is a nigger. We slave and slaughter here. Albion is story. And you, coolie, who only land this morning, best keep quiet till you can deserve to claim a peace. Now, Rohini and Miriam's conversation here is really, it represents the tension between the Afro-Creoles and the Indo-Caribbeans that's present even till this day. In fact, it's a tension that, if you look at the international sections of the newspaper, it's present politically to this day in places like Trinidad and Guyana, where so far since independence, the prime ministers and the dominant political parties have come from the Afro-Caribbean sections, and it's something that's still very much part of the history of the place, of who gets to rule after the colonial leaves. Now, Miriam and Rohini's ambivalent battle, a struggle that is centered around their mutual hatred of the colonial system and their mutual love for the colonizer Gladstone, is brought to a climax when Rohini discovers that she's pregnant with the plantation owner's child. Miriam, who has played mistress to Gladstone for years before Rohini arrives in Guyana and had aborted a number of fetuses conceived with Gladstone, is aghast that a newly arrived coolie woman can dare to bear the master's child so publicly. And of course, reproduction is very much linked to the ability to make narrative. Remember that line, what right have you to make story? What right have you to make baby for Gladstone? Reproduction for these two women is quite clearly linked to making a narrative gesture, writing a history of Guyana. Before her arrival in Guyana, Rohini had rather carefully avoided such narrative possibilities, such reproductive possibilities, with the liberal use of the Kumari seeds her mother had secreted to her before her marriage. Now, these Kumari seeds, literally translated as something like virgin seeds, are part of Rohini's inheritance from India. They're meant to be used as a sort of homegrown contraceptive device. In the counting house, Rohini's Indian Kumari seeds function within a liminal zone. As a contraceptive device, the seeds are Rohini's protection against an unwanted pregnancy early in her marriage to Vidya. By the time Rohini has transported those seeds to the Caribbean, the reader already knows of another deadly potential of the seeds. What Rohini had done back in India in order to facilitate the process of emigration is she had used a potent mixture of the Kumari seeds to kill the cow in her in-law's house. And she thinks, if she can kill the cow, the villagers will take this as a bad omen, and this will force her family to emigrate. And she really wants to emigrate to Guyana, which at this time is painted as the land of rich promise by those wily recruiters of British India. Now, contraception then can both impede and hasten the creation of new life. It can impede literal contraception. It can impede literal conception, but it can also hasten this new life for Rohini, where she can make a new life in Guyana. It is, the Kumari seeds, as the name suggests, is not only curative in that it can defer conception or induce abortion, it is also cosmetic. These seeds, with their eponymous promise of virginity, can erase the past and help maintain the illusion of innocence of a new beginning. When Rohini finally stops recreating virginity through these grains, her clearly planned pregnancy with Gladstone's child threatens to create a new history in the Caribbean, a history that of the commingling of the Indo-Caribbean with the British, with the Afro-Creole. And it's a history that Eric Williams, the historian I mentioned, will summarily relegate to the sidelines a century later. Despite the complicated genealogies of the Kumari seed, the novel does attempt to invoke images of specifically South Asian food products to create the Indian laborer's Guyana. And you knew I was going to talk about food because Bunny already told you that, right? So, the episodes which are marked by consumption or preparation of Indian foods, for example, are often moments of collision between the two worker communities of the plantation, the freed blacks and the coolies. The indentured laborers feast on rotis and potato curry when a Creole is whipped publicly. The Afro-Caribbean and the Indo-Caribbean population commune in a grotesque lunch party where colonial violence mingles freely with West Indian rum and East Indian curry. While the black workers are tempted to try the potato curry cooked by women such as Rohini, they are also scornful of the new tastes imported by these usurpers. And that's what they're seen as. They're the new usurping laboring class. Miriam is the ex-slave woman, the black woman. She tries a puluri or a fritter, and she spits it out in disgust, crying for coconut water to combat the spiciness of the pepper. A theme such as this, of course, does less to cement the static, antagonistic Afro-Creole and East Indian cultures, and in fact points to the very porousness of such lines of cultural distinctions. Because if we remember that the coconut water which the New World Afro-Creole seeks refuge in originates in the tropical Southeast Asia, and the pepper, which adds the spice to the fritter, would not have found a place in Rohini's kitchen, and in fact in any of our South Asian kitchens, if the Dutch traders had not carried it, the New World product, to India in the 16th and 17th centuries. No doubt, and I'm talking not about black pepper, but the other kind of mirchi. No doubt, Rohini and Miriam do not question the origins of the spices or their familiar staples. Yet when David Dabadine attempts to reach back to an originary point in Indo-Caribbean history through a creative rewriting, the thorny question of authenticity raises its head. And the one thing that happens constantly is the search for the authentic, the search for the original source, is invariably a search that is to be frustrated and deferred. The Counting House attempts to recreate nonetheless, an authentic Indian voice from the debris of forgotten artifacts. So the strategic use of certain Hindustani words for food, such as chana, roti, masala, jalebi, are aimed to create a distinct Indo-Caribbean landscape, a particular kind of sound within Guyana. And women are most often presented as the guardian of these recipes and preparers of foods. It is their culinary performance that generates an East Indian diasporic identity in Dabadine's novel. Thus, the author's gesture towards writing a history of coolies and reinscribing a forgotten South Asian culture rests on female production of particular cultural norms. If women are to be the keepers and producers of culinary and cultural traditions, then in what way is Indo-Caribbean identity also implicitly feminized? Now I will move back to Dabadine's first novel to approximate an answer to that question. The novel, the first novel, the debut novel, is called Intended, and it's a first-person narrative told by an unnamed Indo-Guyanese teenager studying for his A-levels in London. He has immigrated from Guyana and he has come to study for his A-levels. The narrator's friends, Shaz, Patel, Nassim, and Joseph, form the choral background between these Asian and Black teenagers, to this autobiographical fiction. The friendship forged between these Asian and Black teenagers is barely shielded from the war raging between East and West Pakistan, between what will be called Pakistan and Bangladesh, in Asia during the early 70s. This is a novel that's set very explicitly around 1970 to 1972. So even these people with multiple identities, which Bunny sort of has just put on me. We have in this novel, we have a Gujarati who's from Uganda. We have a Muslim who is, originally from West Punjab but has lived in Kenya and has then immigrated to London. We have this character, the narrator, who's of, vaguely Hindu origins from the Caribbean, and yet all these people find themselves polarized and taking sides with this war going on in South Asia. So in the school grounds, the fight is all about who is for Pakistan, who is for an independent Bangladesh, who is on India's side, and the questions continue. Now, as the narrator reads Conrad for his A-levels, he finds his own unexpected intended, that fiancé that, Kurtz has, that Marlowe has to go back to, in Janet, who is the daughter of a middle-class white family. As is often the case, this novel of the artist's coming of age is self-consciously a very literary text in which, characters such as Milton's Lycidas, Conrad's Kurtz and Marlowe, Blake's Tiger are as much a part of working-class London as racist white teenagers, Gujarati shopkeepers, Italian prostitutes, West Indian car mechanics, and Pakistani slumlords. Long flashback sequences of rural Guyana interrupt the protagonist's sexual coming of age and his deepening relationship with this new intended, Janet. If the narrator braves this new heart of darkness, which is now London, to carry riches back home, he also has a Kurtz-like desire to forget home and settle with the natives. The narrator's Guyanese past, filtered through memories of his mother and grandmother, is never effectively forgotten, and old promises come rushing back to the industrious A-level student reading in a seedy bedsit. And he often remembers promises that he's made back home. And he says, I know, and this is a promise he made to his mother, I know that that I must grow up soon so that I can earn lots of money and give her all. And I will marry Gildhari's daughter Sita. I hate Sita. But Mr. Gildhari has a big shop at the top of the road, the biggest in New Amsterdam, packed with all kinds of groceries and fancy things in tins, like sardines and peaches all the way from England, so that me and my mother and my sisters can eat all day and have everything we want. So it's these promises made to the women back home that keeps this young boy in early 1970s London sort of, struggling for his A-levels. Yet while remembering promises made to the women back home, the narrator is acutely ashamed every time he encounters a South Asian immigrant in London, particularly a female one. Even the smell of curry becomes a repulsive reminder of all he wishes to leave behind and enter the privileged world of Oxford. And before going up to Oxford for his first term, he goes to visit an old Pakistani friend's mother. And this is what the mother gives him. She blessed me before I left the house, took my face in her hands and kissed me on both my cheeks. She slipped some money into my blazer pocket and gave me food, 2 tins of meat curry and boiled chana to take to Oxford. She ordered Rashida to wrap up half a dozen chapatis in tin foil and all the samosas she could find in the fridge. Not satisfied she had given me enough, she looked about the room, alighted on a few books on the sideboard, took one up and handed it to me. It was the Quran, an English translation. I feigned gratitude, took up my presents, and left. When I was far from home, I threw away all the food, not wanting my Oxford room to smell with curry and spices. But I kept the book, because a book is valuable and dignified. I felt bad as the food plopped into the bottom of the bin. For a moment, I thought of retrieving it. But only for a moment. He doesn't retrieve it. While the narrator seems to choose the world of the text, the Quran over the kebabs, and wants to find escape to a refined literary world, a world far from rural poverty of interior Guyana, a world far from Pakistani shopkeepers in London, a world certainly far from the abject, newly arrived indentured laborers from India. Dabadeen, the author himself, does realize, this is what the narrator wants to do, but Dabadeen himself does realize that the rewards of literature, the material riches, the dinner parties are really in exchange for a narrative of hunger and abjection. So authors like Dabadeen, who, and if the narrator is trying to stay away from these, from these lower middle class Pakistanis, in these cramped quarters in London, but Dabadeen, the author himself, realized that it is these very narratives, these stories of hunger and abjection and the stories of degradations, that especially from authors coming from places like Guyana or Trinidad or even South Asia, it is these kind of stories that in the end win the material riches. And these are the stories that take us to the fancy dinner parties and nice conferences where there's good food served after receptions. So Dabadeen now, and we'll think about all this when we eat, right? So in a poem, in his collection called Coolie Song, a poem which begins with the line, "Now that peasantry is in vogue," he writes, "We mark your memory in songs, fleshed in the emptiness of folk, poems that scrape bowl and bone, in English basements far from home, or confess the lust of beasts in rare conceits to congregations of the educated, sipping wine, attentive between courses. See the applause fluttering from their white hands, like so many messy table napkins." He marks the labor of the East Indian woman's work, of preparing food and passing down words, and in this sense he perhaps sees himself as an inheritor of an Indo-Caribbean history, a descendant of the Coolie woman who had crossed the Kalapani, perhaps clutching a child out of wedlock like Naipaul's grandmother, and a woman who perhaps started a new life in the New World. Now, interestingly, after independence in South Asia, after 1947, certain sections of the Muslim population and Hindu population in places like Trinidad and Guyana, in fact, wanted to return to Pakistan and India. Particularly the Muslims wanted to return to the new Muslim homeland, and they wrote to the new prime ministers. However, both Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Jawaharlal Nehru wrote to the governments and peoples of Guyana and Trinidad and asked these diasporic South Asians to not make the return voyage. I mean, what other choice did they have in a place that's already overpopulated? But it's a very significant moment, that letter they sent. And they asked them to remain where they were and make a new life, a new South Asian community in the Caribbean, which is exactly what they did. But maybe today, by thinking about the cultural products of that generation which left South Asia 150 years ago, we can at least allow a symbolic return home of the Indo-Caribbean. And I will conclude with one final thought. While the Western Academy is increasingly interested in Indo-Caribbean literary production, we still notice a dearth of women writers from the area. There are a few women poets like Mahaday Das, Rajkumari Singh, but it is still a field of unequal representation. While women's experiences and women's voices are being represented in the text with increasing frequency within this genre, such as works like Dabadeen, the representation itself continues to be through a male voice. However, there are some younger women writers in the horizon of people who are of Indo-Caribbean descent, some even that I know who are, their first book is with the publishers and it's coming out. And perhaps in the next century, we shall be discussing the novels of the female V.S. Naipals and the Dabadeens, the granddaughters of those Coolie women. Thank you.